In today's gospel lesson, we hear a continuation of what we began last week with our discussion a bit about what we call the Beatitudes, that in the Gospel of Luke are a series of blessings and woes, blessings and curses. It's very much like in Matthew's Gospel, as we described. Jesus began his Sermon on the Mount with those teachings and then went on to teach a number of other things. And so too here. Slightly different, as last week's Beatitudes were slightly different. So it's a little bit of a different take on what is in the heart and the mind of Jesus. But today we see something that is probably very difficult for us to fathom. Because if you take all of the things that we just heard Jesus say, we could kind of focus them by thinking about the word forgiveness. Because forgiveness is probably one of the most difficult things for us as humans to do. We heard in the first lesson today about Joseph. Now, if anybody had a right to be angry and upset and vindictive, it would be Joseph. His brothers, after all, sold him into slavery. But you see, Joseph had a broader vision. By the time he meets his brothers again, as we hear in today's lesson, he has seen the hand of God at work in his life. He has seen himself as part of the greater work of God for the sake of his family and his kin. And so we hear how he doesn't hold it against his brothers for selling him into slavery, but rather sees the hand of God in all of this. That somehow God had a plan. And so Joseph forgives his brothers and sisters because he had a bigger vision. And maybe that's how we need to see the teachings of Jesus today, that we're really not talking about anything in specific, but we're talking about the bigger vision that Jesus has for the kingdom of God, for us as the children of God. And again, that vision is rooted in this idea of forgiveness. That's a value and an act that in our day and age and in our society is not well or deeply appreciated. In fact, it seems lately that everything is about the exact opposite. It's about getting even. Jesus makes very clear that if that's your attitude, you're no different than anybody else. And that's exactly the point, because you see, we as human beings are hardwired in that way. That's the way we are made. Why? Well, before history was written, before we had this thing we call a frontal cortex and all that sort of thing, and we can think wonderful philosophical thoughts, whenever there was a threat, we had to either run from it or we had to fight it. That's the most basic part of our brains. That's why I say it's hardwired in. When we were wandering as a group of people on the savannah and you saw tigers and lions and bears, so to speak, after you, your first response was panic and anxiety. And so you wanted to make sure that you had the strength you needed either to fight or you ran as fast as you could. Being vulnerable was not a part of the equation. Because if you were vulnerable in that context, you died. It's that simple. And that went on for generation after generation after generation after generation after generation, and so on, for so long that it's now part of who we are. But Jesus comes to us with a new way of thinking. Jesus is telling us that God's way is different, because God never intended the world to be that way. That we can, as the children of God, I should say we are capable of thinking of it in a different way. And so that's what Jesus outlines here. He tells us that the way forward to peace, the way forward to true contentment in our lives, is to be vulnerable. To be able to willingly give up whatever it is we are holding on to protect us, to give it away. That in fact is not a mark of weakness, but a mark of strength. Because it opens us up to the possibility that maybe, like Joseph, we can see a bigger vision. We can see a world that is different than the world in which we live. And we can be part of bringing that world into being. We can be part of the work of bringing to reality the values of the kingdom of God. And so Jesus teaches us that we should forgive. Jesus teaches us that if someone slights us, it isn't appropriate within the children of God to slight someone back. Jesus teaches us that if someone has need of something we possess, we should give it to them. That's not the way of the world. Because the way of the world is the way that I described before. It's normal, it's natural. But Jesus is saying the kingdom of God turns all of that on its head. Because all that has ever done for the human race is bring us suffering and pain and hurt and ultimately death. Jesus is teaching us that in order to find life, we need to make ourselves vulnerable one to another. Now, why is that? I think the answer is pretty plain. It is very hard to love someone when they are not vulnerable. Because you see, that normal reaction that we have to survive, by its very nature, pushes danger away. And when we are in relationship with one another, we can never be truly certain that the person we are in relationship with will not hurt us. And so the way of the world is simply to remain safe, to make sure that everyone stays at arm's length. And when we do that, it is impossible to love. Because the very energy of love is to let someone into your life, not to push them out. And so it is counterintuitive, countercultural, as it were, to be a people of love. You know, you've heard me talk about this before. I like to use the term the tyranny of nice. That somehow people expect us to be nice to each other, to be nice to people in the world, without really understanding where that comes from. Where it comes from is this command by Jesus to be vulnerable to one another. And we don't do that because we're weak. We do it because we're strong. We do it because, like the poor and the hungry and the homeless that we heard about last week, we rely on the strength and grace of God to do these things. Now, It seems like a very tall order, and so it is. It's very hard, but let me give you a little bit of advice. And I think the advice is actually in Jesus' teaching. If we try to do all of that all at once, we won't succeed. Can't. How many of you have made a New Year's resolution, either this year or in years past, to get more fit? So you look at her. To get more fit, so we join a gym. We go to the gym and we exercise. Oh, yes. And 3 days later we go like, what did I do to myself? We feel pain in muscles we didn't even know we had. And then we don't go back. Because why should I get more pain? Jesus says something very common sense. Just like a trainer at a gym would tell you, don't start out at the top of the heap. Start out slow. Start out small. Do little things. And do them over and over and over again until you build the strength muscle. The same is true of our moral muscles. Begin to be a people of forgiveness and vulnerability when we forgive little things. Maybe we can't forgive the big one, but perhaps because we never learned how to forgive the little things. The little slights, the little words, the things that really don't make a whole lot of difference. Perhaps I forget to forgive when someone cuts me off in traffic. And I come up with a full-blown story and narrative of how stupid and foolish this person is. Never taking into account that maybe, just maybe, the person who cut me off in traffic is a little late to get to work. And they have been told by their supervisor if they're late one more time, they may lose their job. If I knew that, wouldn't I let them go forward? Why can't I see the possibility that maybe, like Joseph being sold into slavery, there is a bigger thing going on here, something that I don't understand? Maybe that would help me to be more forgiving. Perhaps the person who takes my coat takes it because they need to shield their children from the cold. I'm angry with them, and so I curse them for taking the coat that I had, not realizing that the person who took it is trying to do something actually noble. Perhaps then, if I knew that, I would give them my shirt as well. You see, we develop these moral muscles inside of us. We develop our vulnerabilities, our capacities for the strength that is vulnerability by doing the little things every day. Not trying to become the perfect person all at once, but striving day after day, creating little habits where it isn't a matter of me being nice all the time, the tyranny of nice, but rather I just am. Because that's the muscle that I'm using day in and day out. Jesus' teaching sounds very lofty, but it's very practical. If we seek peace and contentment in our life, then maybe that's where we need to begin. By forgiving, by giving, by opening ourselves up to others in ways that simply say, maybe I don't understand why they are the way they are, and forgiving and giving out of generosity, out of compassion, and out of mercy. When we do these things, we grow into the image of Christ. When we do these things incrementally, slowly, piece by piece, like the seed that is planted and grown, we become Christ. We become the one who is open to all. We become the one who can love beyond love's telling. It is absolutely important for us to realize that there is nothing that can keep us from doing this except ourselves. And so, when we hear Jesus teaching these things, it isn't about being perfect. It isn't about growing beyond our imagining. Beyond our capacities. But it is about growing beyond our imagining. Imagining ourselves as a people of love, of justice, of forgiveness, and of peace. Little by little by little. And suddenly, we look in the mirror and we see a child of God.